Section 2 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. Henry of Richmond, Bosworth Field, the Coronation, the Sweating Sickness, 1485-1486, Part 1. It is desirable first to sketch the early life and the accession of the sovereign who was in so many ways to influence the history of England. Henry of Richmond could claim a twofold royal or quasi-royal descent. His father, Edmund Tudor, by creation Earl of Richmond, was son to Catherine of France, the widow of Henry V. Obviously, no original title to the throne could be thus derived, even if it were certain that Catherine was ever married to Owen Tudor, of which unfortunately no evidence is known to exist. Yet, with the ideas of succession prevalent in those times, such an origin might add force to other stronger claims. Henry's maternal descent constituted such a claim, inasmuch as his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was great-granddaughter to Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt, and although the Beauforts were illegitimate, yet after their birth John married their mother, Catherine Roe, the sister-in-law of the poet Chaucer, and succeeded in inducing Richard II to carry through Parliament in 1397 an act for their legitimation, which, however, did not allow them to bear the name of Plantagenet. This act was confirmed in 1407 by Henry IV, who seems to have thought that by introducing the words excepta dignitate regia into Richard's original grant, as preserved in the patent rolls, he was barring the Beauforts from succession to the throne, although the document of confirmation as submitted by him to Parliament contained no such exception. As the latter was of course authoritative, Henry inherited from John of Gaunt a parliamentary title to the throne in case of failure, first of the lines of John's elder brothers, and secondly of heirs from his earlier marriages. Both of these contingencies had in great measure occurred. The line of the Black Prince, Edward's eldest son, had ended with the unhappy Richard II in 1399. William, the next brother, died early, and the House of York, the representatives of Lionel, the third brother, had been almost exterminated. As for John's earlier marriages, the Lancastrian line, beginning with Henry IV, whose mother was Blanche of Lancaster, had also become extinct when the young Edward, son of Henry VI, was murdered by his uncles on the field of Tewkesbury. Thus, when Henry VII succeeded to the throne, his only rivals in title were John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, the son of Richard III's sister Elizabeth, who had been declared by Richard heir to the throne, his brother, the Earl of Suffolk, Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence, put to death by Edward IV, his sister Margaret, afterwards Countess of Salisbury, and Elizabeth, the daughter of Edward IV. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, successively Countess of Richmond and of Derby, was, as will be shown in a subsequent chapter, one of the most remarkable women in English history. Her father was John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset. On his death in 1444, she became the ward of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and by him was married at the age of 9 to his son, who afterwards succeeded to the title. On her guardian's attainder, she was transferred to the custody of Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and his brother Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, the former of whom, Edmund Tudor, became her husband in 1455, her former marriage having been simply set aside. Both these noblemen had been treated as brothers by Henry VI, who bestowed great care on their education and received from them loyal support in the Civil War, Jasper Tudor having been engaged in several of the chief battles and attainted with the King and Margaret of Anjou in 1461. Edmund Tudor died 5 years before this last event, a few months before his son's birth. The Countess of Richmond, thus widowed at the age of 16, lived for a while in her brother-in-law's castle at Pembroke, and then, in 1459, married her cousin Lord Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham, and through him descended from Thomas of Woodstock, the sixth son of Edward III., the Duke of Gloucester, who was so foully kidnapped and murdered by Richard II. In 1482 she was again a widow, but soon married Lord Stanley, a widower with a numerous family. There are circumstances connected with this last union which give the impression that she entered into it unwillingly and merely in order to gain protection for her son, for whom alone she seemed really to live. For this purpose her husband was well chosen, as he was a strong Yorkist. Indeed, but for this marriage her life would have been forfeited in 1483 for the part which she took in Buckingham's rebellion against Richard III. Soon after this she succeeded in gaining over Lord Stanley to her son's party. In 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, Jasper Tudor followed Margaret's advice by sending the young Henry, his nephew, out of the country. Henry was now 15 years old, and it was his mother's wish that he should take refuge with Louis XI. of France. This plan, however, failed, for he was wrecked on the Breton coast, and had to pursue the life of imprisonment and surveillance which became so familiar to him. Indeed, he once said to Philippe de Comines that from the age of 5 years he had constantly been kept and concealed as a fugitive in prison. Edward IV. and Richard III. made repeated attempts to recover him from Francis II., Duke of Bretagne. Richard, indeed, promised to make him his son-in-law if surrendered. Accordingly, by the contrivance of Landois, Francis's minister during his master's illness, Henry was sent to Saint-Malo to be delivered up. But receiving a hint from his faithful supporter, Bishop Morton, that Landois was trying to get for his master in exchange for his surrender the earldom of Richmond, which had formerly been held by the Dukes of Bretagne, he escaped, first into the woods and then into French territory at Angers. Here he was well received, and the circumstances of the country soon made it highly expedient to support his claim to the English throne. For as Richard III. was sending archers to France in support of the French nobles in their attempt to raise a second war of the public good against the young Charles VIII., who had just succeeded his father on the French throne, the wise and politic Anne of Beaujeu, Duchess of Bourbon, who was regent during her brother's minority, allowed Henry in 1485 to collect about 2,000 men, des plus méchants qu'on put trouver, says Philippe de Comines, and also supplied a small sum of money to help the descent on England. Accordingly, on August 7th in that year, Henry landed at Milford Haven, and immediately took the decided step of sending circulars calling for help against Richard as an usurper of his rights to the throne and a rebel. He then marched to Shrewsbury, where he received the adhesion of Rhys ap Thomas and other Welsh chiefs. Ap Thomas had sworn that the invader should only enter England over his belly. It is said to have been suggested by high authority that he might discharge himself from this vow by lying down on the ground and letting Henry step over him, or by going under a bridge while Henry crossed it above him. In making not for Worcester and the Lower Severn, but for Shrewsbury, Henry had in view his stepfather Lord Stanley's Cheshire influence. At Stafford he heard that Stanley could not immediately join him without sacrificing the life of his son, Lord Strange, whom Richard had seized as a hostage, but going almost alone in advance of his army to his camp at Atherstone, he received from him the most encouraging promises of support. At almost the same moment he was joined by Sir Walter Hungerford and Sir Thomas Bourchier, two of Richard's trusted officers, with a body of choice troops. From Atherstone he turned eastward to meet Richard, who was encamped between Hinckley and Market Bosworth. Even with the reinforcements just acquired, he had scarcely 5,000 men, barely half the number of Richard's forces, so that his chance of victory was small unless more leaders deserted to him in the battle. Mr. Gardiner, in his excellent History of Richard III., has stated very clearly the causes which led to Henry's decisive success. Richard had, it appears, been misled by a prediction which he had heard about his rival's landing at Milford, referring, as he imagined, to a small village of that name near Christchurch in Hampshire. Accordingly, he had taken very few effective precautions to secure the fidelity of the Welsh leaders or of Sir W. Stanley, who had the chief power in North Wales. As to Lord Stanley, Richard seems to have had the incapacity, not uncommon in tyrants, to reflect that those whom they injure are certain to remember the wrong when they themselves have forgotten it. His soldiers had all but murdered Lord Stanley on the day when he sent Lord Hastings to the block, yet he trusted him in a manner to the last, making, however, a breastwork in rear of his own camp for fear of being attacked by him. As for Sir W. Stanley, he had been declared a traitor even while commanding for Richard. It is most satisfactory to find that Richard's chance of ultimate success had departed from him as soon as the murder of his nephews in the Tower became known. Indeed, revolt after revolt thenceforward made it clear that even though he might succeed in cajoling the mother and sister of the victims, he could not silence the groans and indignation with which his atrocious act was stigmatized in every street and market-place of England. The feeling against him was like that against King John for his treatment of Arthur, or against the Emperor Sigismund during his London visit in 1416 for the murder of John Huss. Making a virtue of necessity, Richard acknowledged, as we are informed, his crime in his final address to his soldiers, but pleaded that he had washed it away by salt tears and strict penance. He was, however, quite unable to excite the emotion which he desired. Advancing by the road from Hinckley to Stapleton and Market Bosworth, Richard drew out his forces on Sutton Heath. His enemy's position was difficult to force, as Redmore Plain, on which the Lancastrian troops were drawn out, was covered on the left and rear by a brook hard to cross, and on the right by Sutton Ambion Wood and a morass, an arrangement which evidently made it necessary for Henry to conquer or die, as retreat would have been most difficult. Yet, after all, Richmond made the common mistake of inexperienced soldiers, and desired his men to advance beyond the morass, thus running the risk of seeing them driven in, and the whole position carried by the enemy's rush. Seeing the danger, the veteran Earl of Oxford first ordered the men not to move 10 feet from the standard, and then, when he had got them well in hand, seized the right moment for hurling them on the enemy, who seemed indisposed to advance and unlikely to make much resistance. At this moment Lord Stanley deserted Richard, and with him the Earl of Northumberland, while the Duke of Norfolk, Richard's firm supporter, was slain, and his son, the Earl of Surrey, taken prisoner. Few events in English history are better known than those which immediately followed. Richard's catching sight of his rival and charging him desperately, his Plantagenet prowess in the fight, his refusal to fly, the coming up of Sir W. Stanley, Richard's shouts of treason, treason, as he struck right and left, his fall with many wounds, the finding by Reginald Bray in a thorn bush of the crown which Richard had worn on his helmet, and the crowning of Henry with it by Lord Stanley. The battle may be considered typical of the period at which it occurred, combining as it did the use of such modern weapons as cannon, as proved by the balls from time to time dug up on the field, with a medieval encounter almost hand to hand between the competitors for the throne. The victor followed the bad precedent of the Wars of the Roses by ordering some of the prisoners to be at once executed. As, however, his vengeance only lighted upon Catesby, the minister of Richard III., and 2 of his agents, he was considered to have been strangely merciful. The distribution of due honours and rewards was deferred, with some exceptions, till the meeting of Parliament in November. End of Section 2.